Okay, folks, so we are in our last part of the Native American, uh, or Native Americans in the United States unit. We're going to talk a little bit about some contemporary issues. I do want to put a couple of disclaimers in over the next two lectures that we're going to talk a lot about violence that affected Indigenous communities. So, I want to be mindful for folks who have triggering issues. There will be discussions of violence against children, sexual assault. There won't be anything graphic, but I just wanted to put that out there as we talk about these very difficult issues and very dark times for Native communities. One thing to particularly note that we are in Native American History Month and we are on the eclipse of um, uh, Thanksgiving or Thanksgiving. And at this time, we want to remember that, like with all myths about Native communities, many of these uh, many of these holidays that we celebrate often mask a dark time in Native American history. We can think back to Columbus Day and the horrific way in which Columbus treated many of the indigenous people in the Caribbean. And so we should always be mindful as we have these types of conversations that we're critically reflecting on these historical touchstones and moments. And what we'll see in our next lecture as we discuss Native American representation, particularly mascots, oftentimes there is a lack of sensitivity to the experiences in history that these folks face. And so we want to be very clear that Native American communities have been under attack for many, many years. It has evolved, and we'll discuss that evolution here in this lecture today. And with that, we want to be very careful and concerted in our conversations and our movements towards supporting these communities as they heal and seek justice, right? So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to talk about the continued Indian problem, and I'm going to discuss settler colonialism as a kind of analytical framework. We'll be covering what is the continued Indian problem, shifts in the Indian War, which we've talked about extensively in the last two lectures, BIA, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the mistreatment of Indians, looking at boarding schools and Indian adoption, how BIA policies and the US government enacted a form of cultural genocide, the convergence of BIPOC issues and white supremacy, looking particularly at the issues affecting Native communities and how that kind of extends across multiple groups and how this is all enmeshed in a system of white supremacy, settler colonialism and the Indian problem and what this actually means in terms of how this is promulgated, settler colonialism and white supremacy. And then I'm going to round out with a slight discussion on civil rights. There are key figures in the civil rights movements for Native Americans, and two movements in particular. Our key terms for today are deficit thinking, cultural genocide, and settler colonialism. And I'll talk about those more in detail as we get into the slides later in the lecture. So first, we want to recognize and remember the fact that Native Americans were a heavy presence in the United States or what is now considered the United States, and that the US government engaged in a total war to conquest the West, basically. On the right here, or what would be the left of the slide, you can see a map of land acquisition or theft by the US government, right? So from 1784 until present day, there's been a very concerted and very heavy land reduction. And if we look here in present day in terms of what are now the new Indian reservations, they're very, very small, right? So they're this kind of whole totality of the continental United States in terms of what was originally their territories to this reduction of almost nothingness, right? And so the US in this case adopted many of the colonialistic principles of their European predecessors to build empire. And essentially this was for God, gold, and glory. And if we remember back to Manifest Destiny, it was built upon these kinds of pillars, right? Or these logics of taking, right? So this idea that the US was destined by God to own or control the land. It was also inevitable, right? So there was this kind of eventuality that it was going to happen. And so that rationalized that theft. Um, it was specifically to expand the democracy and capitalism of, or the capitalist thinking of the U.S., which is again kind of this a sense of glory, and then obviously to gather wealth from the land, right? Which was both um, a concerted desire and also a kind of happenstance consequence, right? And so as the U.S. is realizing that it needs to build its empire and build its presence in the world, it recognizes that the only way to do so is through land. And if we think again to the resources in this region, whether we're talking about agricultural or arable land, think about the entire totality of the United States and all the area that you can farm. That's huge, right? Which also gave way to slavery. So despite the fact that there was, probably thousands of dollars of treasure taken from native peoples, gold, turquoise, silver, oil, so on and so forth, right? All of that land stolen was then terraformed or was then reused or utilized for agriculture, but within the specific context of slavery, right? And so that was again expanding not only the mineral extractive sense in the sense that the United States was able to take much of that natural resource, but then also make profits off of slavery, which bolstered that empire, right? And so this process, or the Indian problem, I should say, is basically promulgated on the US desire to establish itself as a global superpower. And so around the 20th century, the United States government is coming to a very real or a great realization that it is becoming almost impossible to continue the Indian Wars for two reasons. One is that it's extremely costly, right, to arm their soldiers and keep sending them out against natives that essentially are not going away, right? They're going to continue to resist to maintain their lifeways and maintain their lands. And so that becomes a problem. And then how do you recruit people to keep fighting a war that they're clearly not winning, right? And we've seen this in terms of Afghanistan recently with the withdrawal of troops from there. We realize that, these concerted wars in territories that are not our own become are unwinnable in that, the indigenous population or the folks that are already living there are not going to give up their lifeways or, their land, right? And so North American governments, both the U.S. and Canada, and I'm going to reference Canada here because a lot of their policies mirrored our own, or ours mirrored theirs in a way. But essentially, each country both developed a kind of governmental agency to deal with Indians. In our case, it's called the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And it was to essentially build educational, land management, and economic programs. But it wasn't to benefit indigenous people, rather that it was to impose a particular lifeway. And we see this particularly with the Dawes Act, which is passed in 1887, which instituted a change into Native cultures with respect to land. And what the Dawes Act essentially forced natives to do was to change their existing land relationship. So if we remember back to that, a comparative analysis between Europeans and indigenous people's relationship to the land was one of stewardship. So they never felt that they could own the land, rather that it was their duty by their creator and their cultural spirits to maintain the land and live in this kind of symbiotic harmony, where European, and in this case American culture, was all about private ownership, right? We need to own the land and use it, for this sense of building gold, right, or building wealth. And so the Dawes Act imposed a new land management system, which was a marked shift away from the ways that natives eventually or had previously cared for the land. And then it also imposed a capitalist system, right? So that not only were natives to own the land in a way that they never had previous relationships to the land in the sense of private ownership, but to utilize the land for capitalist exploits, right? And much of this is motivated by a man by the name of Richard Henry Pratt. I've included a quote here down at the bottom, but he's famously noted as being the person who coined the idea of kill the Indian, save the man, right? And he mentions in this quote, I'm just going to kind of paraphrase it here, you can read it on your own, but he essentially is in favor of a total war and an outright destruction of Native peoples. But he also believes that you can do this without actually killing the natives, right? And this is where he comes up with this idea of kill the Indian and save the man. And this policy that, or this political framework and intellectual framework actually starts to inform the ways in which the BIA will treat natives, as we'll see in a second. And so the Bureau of Indian Affairs is a reconciliation program that doesn't really have the best interests of communities of color in mind. And so essentially, it's rife with issues. And one of the first things that it tries to do is institute Native boarding schools, okay? And so BIA agents essentially took kids from their respective homes and put them into these boarding schools from anywhere from 3 to 10 or 15 years, depending on their age and depending on what was needed. By 1925, 1 in 4 Native children, or over 60,000, 61,000 Native children were in these schools. There were 367 boarding schools operating in 29 states. The Genoa boarding school, which I believe is in Iowa, they just recently uncovered a mass grave there, and there were over 100 indigenous children found, which was akin to a boarding school that they found in Canada recently, or that a mass grave that they found in a boarding school in Canada recently, where there was over 210 children there. The next videos I'm going to show you, again, are going to talk a little bit about this in the graphicness, so I want to provide a disclaimer, but this is going to help us better understand the relationship between the BIA, Richard Henry Pratt, and then the policy towards taking Native children away and what it actually did to these folks.
In 1879, Richard Henry Pratt, the man who coined the phrase "kill the Indian, save the man," would open the first U.S. boarding school for Native American children in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Boarding schools were government-funded and church-run institutions that removed indigenous children from their homes and reservations. At these schools, children were forced to cut their hair, wear Anglo-American clothing, and sometimes even adopt new Anglo-American names if the staff felt that their names were too Indian. They were beaten if they spoke their native languages or observed any of their traditional cultural practices. They were trained to cook, clean, and do manual labor in preparation for jobs as servants in white households. The ultimate purpose of the boarding schools was to forcibly assimilate and anglicize the indigenous population. Several generations of indigenous peoples lost the ability to speak their language altogether, as it had become a source of trauma for them due to the treatment they received at boarding school, nor would they pass it on to their future children. Several generations of indigenous people developed a plethora of mental illnesses, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. These children, and they were children, were often physically, sexually, verbally, and emotionally abused by the staff of the schools. Many children would never even leave and would be buried on the grounds. And it is unknown how many lives were taken, as the excavation of most US sites has not been considered until recently. And really, that's only because of the recent discoveries in Canada. If I've done my editing correctly, you should be seeing a list of 365 known Native American schools in the US. Many were not shut down until the 1980s and 1990s. So this isn't ancient history. There are countless people alive today who can tell you about their experiences in boarding school. The effects are long lasting, and many are still trying to heal from it. Honestly, that there are still those teaching, speaking, and practicing their languages and traditions is nothing short of a miracle. It's often said in Native communities that in learning and practicing and keeping our languages and cultures alive, that is the strongest form of resistance.
This next video is going to talk a little bit about the boarding school healing program. And so this organization is going to have a bit of testimony in the work that they've been doing to try to reclaim language that has been stripped away from this. So after this, I'll give a bit more context.
boarding school policy was far-reaching and devastating as any, maybe more than any, because of the complete and utter destruction of the culture.
They couldn't stop it from happening. So they would take them from further away and make it harder for them children to leave and go home.
It was my first haircut. I cried when I saw my hair on the floor. Tears still well up in my eyes when I remember the way it laid on the floor. Without my Navajo language, I was broken and unable to celebrate my heritage, to express myself. Taking my identity from me made me very powerless.
I managed to learn how to stuff all the I'm sorry, the loneliness that came because I could not talk to my mother or my father. And we were not comforted by the boarding school matrons or teachers. The pain and the loneliness and the anger will always be with me.
We are dealing with the erasure of our people.
This government has been working on destroying tribal societies and institutions for 500 years.
I work with youth on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation quite often, and so many of them tell me that they walk around with like a heavy load on their shoulders. They feel heavy all the time. And I truly believe that what that is they're carrying the traumas of their ancestors, and they're carrying the traumas of their parents and their grandparents. And then they have to carry their own traumas.
It's like our great, beautiful blanket kind of got all chopped into pieces during that boarding school time, or that time when we were trying to assimilate. And we have a lot of the pieces left, and now we're trying to put them all back together. And we're putting them all back together, but it's probably never going to look exactly like our blanket was before. So, but it will still keep us warm. It'll still help us. It will still sustain us.
And it hurts to know that I can't give them the things that my parents could have given me if not for boarding school.
Only by bringing it into the light can we begin to heal from it. And that's the first step that we're moving toward.
If our tribal cultures are going to stay alive, other than existing as pockets of poverty and sadness, we have to heal. And telling the story, and then help finding resources to turn things around. That's what the coalition wants to do.
The eventual outcomes we would hope would come out of the boarding school healing project would be healing programs that are put together by our own Indian people and their own Indian communities.
We're changing the paradigm of education each day. We're saving the language one child at a time. How do you preserve a language? You create a speaker.
This healing is not just happening on the Native side. It's not just for us that needs to heal over this history. It's also the non-Native community that's really struggling with this healing.
Much more important that we share with our children that we tell them stories. It's not a very easy thing to do, but be strong. People my age need to be strong and just think about where we've been and teach it to our children.
So a couple big takeaways here, and obviously what we've seen is this policy was, as mentioned, a practice of native erasure, right? And what we see, the shift in the Indian War is no longer about actually wiping out the bodies, but more about wiping out the culture and the history. And these policies and programs work in a way to, one, target children and to disconnect them, right? To force them to adopt a new lifeway system in a way that destabilizes their communities. And I'll talk about this a little bit in a second when we get into the paradigm of, or the three pillars of white supremacy as discussed by Andrea Smith, the author that you read for this lecture. But we want to be very clear that this was not something indiscriminate, or this was something that wasn't innocent, right? This wasn't an educational policy that was meant to just educate children, but actually a mechanism to destroy culture. And if we think about segregated education, which emerged after this or around the same time, those schools that separated Chinese students and Mexican students from their home languages, and then also confined Black students to a educational environment that reinforced Americanism, all did this exact same thing, right? And so again, these overarching systems of racism and white supremacy connect all of these individuals, as the policy has been to denigrate Native communities or denigrate communities of color and supplant their identity with one that is white, right? To inferiorize their own and force them to essentially, believe and or adopt these kind of white supremacist or white centered sentiments. Here we can see some early examples of the boarding school. So obviously we saw a lot of these assimilation paradigms where we see individuals, cutting their hair, becoming lighter skinned, obviously practicing Christianity, which was not, native to them. They had their own kind of cultural and spiritual life ways, children being forced to pray in their bunk beds, and lots of different examples of children in these environments where they're adopting, there's these non-native ways of life, right? Beyond this, though, and this next video is going to talk a little bit about the boarding schools in more detail, but talk about another similar paradigm was the native adoptions. And so Indian adoptions was a widespread practice shortly after many of the indigenous boarding schools were closed in the 1960s due to some civil rights leadership and activism, which I'll talk a little bit at the end of this lecture about. But what undergirds both the Indian boarding school policies and the Indian adoption policies was about trying to find deficit in Native culture. And so essentially the US government, relying on those racist narratives or racist notions about Native communities being uncivilized, savage, so on and so forth. And as a result, using that as a justification to send their children away to boarding schools, which were all over the world. And many times these children were sent to schools that were very far away from their home communities. And in this case, actually ripped away from their families and sent to live with white folks, right? And so I want you to hold on to this idea of deficit thinking because it's very powerful. And this is something that is often used against communities of color. We see this with Latinos and immigrant parents. There's been a long history of castigating immigrant parents, and especially Latinx immigrant parents, as not caring about education. We see this a lot with Black fatherhood in its absence, rather than recognizing the fact that many Black men who want to be fathers have been ripped away from their families because they're in systems of mass incarceration, so on and so forth, right? And so what we can see in this next example is how this continued movement to move away from a direct form of violent genocide has actually evolved into this systematic practice of taking Native children and destroying the Indian in them for the explicit purpose of performing what we would call cultural genocide, which I'll explain a bit in a second. But again, it's still a practice of killing the Indian. It's just assuming that we're not going to do this directly through violence, but rather through these indirect and systematic ways that disconnect Natives from their culture and history.
I was adopted by a white missionary couple.
I was adopted.
Immediately placed for adoption.
I was in foster care with one family for 18 years. They were white.
My parents loved us, and I understand that, but at the same time,
they took the idea that they were saving me.
Saving us from ourselves.
Being saved, and I should be grateful for the life that I've been given, because any child on the reservation would give anything to live as I was living.
They took us away from our mom. They came marching right in and literally took us and thousands of other children from their home.
It's a way to eradicate us. And to go to a nation's children is one of the sure ways to do that.
The U.S. has a long and brutal legacy of attempting to eradicate Native Americans. For centuries, they colonized Native American lands and murdered their populations. They forced them west and pushed them into small, confined patches of land. But Native Americans resisted. A Board of Indian Commissioners report said, instead of dying out under the light and contact of civilization, the Indian population is steadily increasing. And that was an obstacle to total American expansion. So the US found a new solution to absorb and assimilate them. It all started with an experiment and a man named Richard Henry Pratt.
He had in his charge some prisoners of war, and he taught these men how to speak English, how to read and write, and how to do labor. He dressed them in military uniforms and basically ran an assimilation experiment. And then he took his results to the federal government and said, they're capable of being civilized. So he was able to get this project funded.
In 1879, the government funded Pratt's project, the first ever off-reservation boarding school for Native American children. His motto was to kill the Indian and save the man. What started there at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School was nothing short of genocide, disguised as American education. Children were forcibly taken from reservations and placed into the school, hundreds, even thousands of miles away from their families. They were stripped of their traditional clothing. Their hair was cut short. They were given new names and forbidden from speaking their native languages.
To take our children and to indoctrinate them into Western society, to take away their identity as Indigenous peoples, their tribal identity. I think it's one of the most effective and insidious ways that the US did do harm to Indigenous peoples here, because it targeted our children, our most vulnerable. And they tried to make us ashamed for being Indian, and they tried to make us something other than Indian.
There are also accounts of mental, physical, and sexual abuse, of forced manual labor, neglect, starvation, and death.
My great-grandfather went to Carlisle, and nobody in my family ever talked about it. So if you Google Indian boarding schools, the majority of the pictures that you will see will be actually from Carlisle. Colonel Pratt created propaganda. He hired a photographer to create those before and after photos to show that his experiment was working. So it was, intentional propaganda.
And it worked. The Carlisle model of education swept the country and led to the creation of over 350 boarding schools to assimilate Native American children.
On the one hand, we have the Navajo as we find him in the desert. Few of these boys and girls have ever seen a white man. Yet, through the agencies of the government, they are being rapidly brought from their state of comparative savagery and barbarism to one of civilization.
In 1900, there were about 20,000 Native American children in these schools. By 1925, that number more than tripled. Families that refused to send their kids to these schools faced consequences like incarceration at Alcatraz or the withholding of food rations. Some parents who did lose their children to these schools even camped outside to be close to them. Many students ran away. Some found ways to hold on to their languages and cultures. Others, though, could no longer communicate with family members. And some never returned home at all. By stripping the children of their Native American identities, the US government had found a way to disconnect them from their lands. And that was part of the US strategy. During the same era in which thousands of children were sent away to boarding schools, a number of US policies infringed on their tribal lands back home. In less than 5 decades, 2/3 of Native American lands had been taken away.
The whole thing was purposeful. And the fact that it has been buried in the history books and not acknowledged is also intentional. And in fact, the same tactics were used in New Zealand, Australia, Canada. All of these countries have acknowledged, apologized, or reconciled in some way, except for the United States.
Over time, the brutality of boarding schools started to surface. And after a 1928 report detailed the horrific conditions at some schools, many began to close. In the 1960s, Indigenous activism rose alongside the civil rights movement. And by the 1970s, that activism forced more schools to shut down. The government handed over control of the remaining boarding schools to tribes to be run in partnership with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But just as the boarding school era started fading, another assimilation project took shape: adoption. The main goal of this pilot project was to stimulate the adoption of American Indian children to primarily non-Indian adoptive homes. They claimed it was to promote the adoption of the forgotten child, but it was essentially a continuation of the boarding school assimilation tactics. And the strategy came with a financial advantage for the government too. Adoption was cheaper than running boarding schools. But first, adoption officials had to sell white America on the idea of adopting Native American children. Feature stories like this one in Good Housekeeping marketed them to white families. They were described as unwanted, and adoption gave them a chance at new lives. In the end, their media campaign worked. White families wanted Indian adoption. But the problem was, many of these children were not orphans that nobody wanted. They were kids often ripped apart from families that wanted to keep them.
You still will hear stories today of people, my age, older, saying, I remember as a child, the social worker was coming and people would hide their children.
On reservations, social workers used catch-all phrases like child neglect or unfit parenting as evidence for removal. But their criteria was often questionable. Some accounts describe children being taken away for living with too many family members in the same household.
An extended family is a big thing for Native people. And that means being judged for being in a house that's overcrowded. So it's always whiteness is the standard for success. And everything else is judged by that standard.
By the 1960s, about 1 in 4 Native children were living apart from their families. The official Indian Adoption Project placed 395 Native American children into mostly white homes, but it was just one of many in an era of Native American adoptions. Other state agencies and private religious organizations began increasingly making placements for Native American children too.
My mother giving me up was a white person telling her if she didn't, she would never see her other kids again.
In one of the documents I have, it's addressed to my biological father, Victor Fox, that he was trying to look us up to get a hold of us. But Hennepin County wrote, Daniel and Douglas are adapting very well in their new family. This was totally, it was a false statement.
When you're adopted, you're missing something. I think I've likened it to having when someone has a 500-piece puzzle and they have all the pieces to make this pretty picture except one.
My adoptive mother was not well, verbally, physically, and sexually and spiritually abusive. So by By the time I was 14, I started drinking. 15, drugs were added, and I became an addict to numb. I didn't realize I was numbing pain.
I tried suicide, tried slicing my wrist one time.
Children were taken and believed like I believed for a long time that there was something wrong with me versus something wrong with the system.
The Indian Adoption Project was considered a success by the people who set it in motion. Officials claimed, generally speaking, we believe the Indian people have accepted the adoption of their children by Caucasian families and have been pleased to learn the protection afforded these children. But the truth was unsettling.
These hearings on Indian children's welfare is now in session.
When I was pregnant with Bobby, and the welfare kept coming over there and asking me if I'd give him up for adoption.
Before he was even born?
Yeah. They picked up my children and placed them in a foster home. And I think that they were abused in a foster home.
4 years after Native people organized in this Senate hearing, Congress passed the Indian Child Welfare Act, known as ICWA.
It gives tribes a place at the table in court.
States would be required to provide services to families to prevent removal of an Indian child. And in case removal was necessary, they would have to try to keep the child with extended family or another Native American family.
Without our relatives, we cease to exist. So with Native people, part of our wealth is in our family. It's in who we're connected to.
But the legacy of family separation in Native communities has been difficult to fully undo. Today, Native American children are 4 times more likely to be placed in foster care than white children, even when their families have similar presenting problems. In these cases, ICWA is often the best legal protection they have, and it's been under attack repeatedly.
A young girl ripped from her foster family because of the Indian Children Welfare Act.
White adoptive families intent on keeping Native American children have tried to do away with the act, and they're often backed by conservative organizations.
The Indian Child Welfare Act was dealt a blow earlier this month.
The subject of a lawsuit issued on Tuesday by the Goldwater Institute, arguing that preferences given to American Indian families to adopt Indian children is unconstitutional and discriminates based on race.
It's a way for these industries, these very powerful industries, to try to attack what Indian identity is.
Wanting to overturn ICWA is connected to everything about who we are as a nation. So if we don't have any protections for our families, and if we don't have protections for our treaties, then we have no more Indians.
We've been under attack. We're going to continue to be under attack. And we have to just keep fighting.
It's in our DNA to survive.
We are nations that pre-exist European contact, and we are still here.
And so what we can see from this example, again, is a concerted policy by the U.S. to rip families apart and to destabilize communities. And one thing to note, as we've been trying to make these connections across different examples, is guess what? Family separation and deportation, like what we see here with Native Americans, right? This idea that immigrants are unfit to maintain their children because they're bringing them across borders, often fleeing violence, as you saw in Harvest of Empire. But this choice to make these dangerous journeys, or these choices to maintain indigenous lifeways, or the fact that they're suffering because of deprivation, discrimination, and dehumanization through policies of the Indian War and these other practices of racism, are creating the conditions for the U.S. to take children away, right? And so essentially the U.S. causes the problem and then, creates another or presents a solution that creates even further problems, right? And so this shift in the Indian policy was to move away from overt genocide, ethnic cleansing of a population, to kill Native cultures, right? And so we're going to take children away from their culture, from their family, and then remove Natives from their ancestral land. This is very akin to what we saw with slavery, with, obviously the ripping of African peoples from, their various lands and tribal communities, mixing them up with folks that weren't like them, and then sending them all over the US, ensuring that their children could not stay together, as many of their children were sold into slavery. And so this massive policy of dehumanization, right? And so what this creates is this idea of cultural genocide. And as we saw with the examples of Indian boarding school, many Native people lost their languages. And we have seen not the effective extinction and or extermination of indigenous people. So there are still folks that trace their ancestral lineage to certain Native communities, but certain cultures have been effectively exterminated or have gone extinct because of these policies, right? And so cultural genocide is the systematic destruction of traditions, values, language, and other elements that make one group of people distinct from another. And as we've seen, this policy is very much doing that by way of what I've mentioned earlier, ripping families apart and making sure that children cannot maintain their cultural legacies, right? And so essentially they have to adopt Americanism. Okay, and so this again is akin to what we saw with other communities of color, right? Marginalization of their children, poor educational opportunities in school environment, racialization of their communities, right? The making of their communities seem inferior and unworthy, clearly with the adoption policy program and with the boarding school movement. And then lack of political voice. And Indians don't actually get citizenship in the United States until 1924. And through the Indian Citizenship Act. And that gave voting rights to natives at the time, but we have still seen very lacking representation in federal government. Deb Haaland, the current Interior Secretary, is one of the most prominent indigenous elected officials. And this person is one of select few of people that have actually even made it that far along. And so despite being on the territory for thousands of years, Natives were never fully included in the US, and their lifeways have essentially been destroyed, right? And so this gives rise to this idea of settler colonialism. And so again, the war with Natives has shifted from direct violent extermination to that of kill the Indian, save the man. Settler colonialism is promulgated on a couple different ideas, with this idea that settlers kind of come to stay. Unlike colonial agents and traders that want to control the land from afar, settlers actually want to take over the land, right? And in that invasive structure, the colonialism persists until they can take over all of the land. And what is most nefarious in this is that it wants to destroy all of the pre-existent lifeways and impose a new one upon it. And the only way to effectively do that is to destroy the Aborigine or destroy the Indian in this case. And essentially what we saw, and you see this even with the Indian adoption case, is that the Indian war itself, in terms of its direct violence, becomes unsustainable, right? It's far too costly to keep waging an all-out war. Then we find that it's actually easier to just go into these already devastated indigenous communities and then take children away, right? And then put them into these boarding schools. Once the boarding school becomes unsustainable, then it's actually just easier to take those children away and put them into white families' homes. And then what actually becomes very dark and nefarious about that is that these concerted white folks who actually probably do care about these children to a certain extent, right? I mean, there are lots of issues with foster systems, and I don't want to disrecognize those here, but what becomes the infighting is that these white families who think that they're doing, good work, are taking children away from these Native communities that are more than well equipped to take care of their own children. And as a result, there becomes this infighting and antagonism between the two, where we're still reifying the notion that Indians are, in deficit, right, or inferior, and are, undeserving of their children, rather than looking at how the US governmental system itself is actually destroying Native families and using the common person as a proxy or a ploy to engage with this war, right? And again, this is a part of the common praxis. We saw this with Mexican Americans and their own schooling systems, teaching them to hate, Mexican or Latinx culture and their language, seeing them as both inferior. Obviously, this wasn't as much of a concerted case with African Americans, but that was because slavery had basically destroyed any and all of their connection to any culture that was in existence on the continent of Africa. And so, again, across all these communities, the same idea that we're going to inferiorize BIPOC communities' cultures, and as a result, right, we are going to, excuse me, remold violently these children to essentially be American and hate their culture, their homes, and their families. And so this is what's predicated on this idea of the 3 pillars of white supremacy. So within this context, we're seeing colonialism and genocide, but in all of these various systems, right, we're seeing a sense of ideology. So capitalism as an ideology, predicated on the idea that we need to enslave people. The best way to make the most amount of money is to work people for nothing to accumulate the most value. And that continues to happen as we see more and more communities of color and poor communities be exploited by various capitalist entities, and then a small group of mostly white men accrue most of the wealth and power in society. Likewise, US nation states continue these policies of genocide under these colonialist frameworks to essentially promulgate themselves as superior, right? US democracy, US culture, American culture, white culture is the best, eradicating the other cultures in existence in a way that only allows for whiteness to exist. And so therefore we believe it because it's the only thing that's there, right? And then as we'll see when we get into the Asian Americans of the United States, this idea of Orientalism, or this sense of making Asian and Asian American folks seem very exotic, and also in a dehumanizing way. And this exoticism in terms of life waves, culture, and religion being antithetical to the US, and therefore enabling or justifying war. And so this short video is going to give a deep explainer on what settler colonialism actually is.
Taking the land which is rightfully ours.
I'd like to think that's what I would have said when the settlers first came to America. It would have avoided settler colonialism and hundreds of years of oppression and genocide for the indigenous people of our country. Hi, my name is Sarah Perdiguera, and I'm a citizen of the Tiwa tribe, also known as Luceta del Sur Pueblo, and a Master of Social Work student at Cal State Northridge. And today, I'd like to talk to you about settler colonialism and its devastating effects on the indigenous people of our country. So what is settler colonialism anyway? In simple terms, settler colonialism is a social or political group of people who come to a new land and claim it as their own. They exploit the land for its value, and during this exploitation, they eliminate the indigenous people of the land so that there's no evidence of their existence. Settler colonialism is a phenomenon that has happened all over the world, not just here in the United States. Many of the world's major countries are guilty of this oppression. Russia, Britain, Spain, and so on have all had groups of their people who have colonized others at the expense of the indigenous people. However, since the first settlers arrived here in the US, the land for indigenous people has slowly been taken away. This visual shows the land occupied by indigenous people pre-colonization and how over time settler colonialism has took that land away. Now all that is left is reservations, and they are still being threatened today. Now that we have a general idea of settler colonialism, let's look at it on a deeper level. Settler colonialism in the United States is made up of 3 parts: the settlers, the indigenous people who inhabited the land, and the slaves who were forcibly brought into the country to extract the value of the land. Each of these parts was very important to the overall goal of settler colonialism, which again was to maximize the value of the land while eliminating any evidence of the indigenous inhabitants. Their primary goal for eliminating the indigenous people was not race, religion, or ethnicity, but access to territory. The mere existence of an indigenous person was evidence that they stole land and are not the heroic pioneers they made themselves out to be. So the indigenous people had to be eliminated by any means necessary. Their weapon of choice? Genocide. According to Patrick Wolf, there are 3 main overlapping phases of genocide used to destroy indigenous peoples. Physical genocide, which included soil epidemics, frontier warfare, and massacres. Biological genocide, which is the removal, relocation, and isolation of indigenous peoples to reservations. and cultural genocide, the removal of all cultural practices, which includes language, traditional clothing, and religion or spirituality. Another method used to eradicate Indigenous people was the concept of blood quantum. The reproduction of Indigenous people was contradictory to the settlers' logic of elimination, and so the blood quantum system was introduced. The blood quantum system measures the degree of ancestry for an individual of a particular tribe. The goal of the system is the dilution of Indigenous blood and eventually their extinction altogether. The elimination of Indigenous people was an important part of the goal of settler colonialism, but their main motive was still greed. To the settlers, the African slaves' reproduction increased the wealth of their owners because the more slaves a settler owned, the more land they could exploit. And so the one-drop rule was born. This meant that any amount of African ancestry, no matter how remote and regardless of physical appearance, they were labeled Black. Although settler colonialism is not a mainstream idea, it has had a profound negative effect on the Indigenous people and African Americans in our country. While we are taught that our nation is built on positive values and heroic pioneering, the evidence is quite the contrary. We can't go back in time and prevent the negative effects of settler colonialism, but we can acknowledge this part of history and work towards healing the historical trauma being felt today. One organization that is focused on this healing is the Indigenous Wellness.
Sorry, I want to move on only because the context for the video is more important than the organization itself. But yeah, as the speaker noted, right, that this system of settler colonialism was predicated on this idea that we had to eradicate Indigenous people because the only way that the U.S. can exist is if there is no natives here. And clearly there were natives here, and their continued existence shows that, one, the land was stolen, and two, was stolen for explicit purposes, i.e., the acquisition of wealth, right? And alongside that, the primary way that the U.S. had acquired its wealth was through African slavery, which is a part of this kind of pillar of white supremacy. So capitalism, which was the undergirding market logic or economic logic within the democratic framework, needed slavery to exist. Democracy in itself, to be able to be spread throughout the United States, needed colonialism and genocide, because if we couldn't go west to get more land, to get more resources and wealth, we couldn't substantiate ourselves as a country, or the U.S. couldn't substantiate itself as a country to have that kind of primacy in the world, or have that kind of agency. And one way that we'll see with Orientalism is that the way that we continue to do this is by finding new villains, or this new folks in the Orient that we want to make war with. And in doing so, we're able to continue this logic of spreading capitalism, spreading democracy in areas that are rife, quote unquote, with issues in terms of the politics and so on and so forth, and that we want to impose our life way upon them because we see it as, quote unquote, better, right? And so much of these issues came to the awareness of Indigenous activists. And as mentioned in the video on Indian boarding schools and the Indian adoption program, we did see civil rights organizations developed by natives to push back against this. There are two that are most notable: AIM, which is the American Indian Movement, and then WARN, which is the Women of All Red Nations. While both of them had different ethoses and praxis, i.e. WARN was primarily a feminist organization, there were many women in AIM doing the work here. So I provided a couple pictures of leaders here. So Dennis Banks on the left, Russell Means in the middle, and Clyde Bellencourt. Their primary goal was to reclaim stolen lands, and they actually led to they were active in the occupation of Alcatraz Island, which was a ancestral site, and occupying Wounded Knee, which was the famous battle with Custer, Custer's last stand. They wanted the restoration and security of treaty rights. Obviously, we've seen that by and large violated over time by the US, right? An end to police harassment and brutality against natives, which has been a persistent issue. And then obviously to affirm Native spirituality, language, and self-determination. So this ability for natives to actually practice their life ways, their language, and determine their own self-interest without outside influence or outside control by the US, right? Warren, on the other hand, led by Laura Lee Decora Means, Madonna Thunderhawk, and Janet McLeod, advocated for Native women's health, physical, mental, emotional, and reproductive, specifically because there had been, a degree to which, and we'll see this in the next lecture, a large amount of violence towards Native women, both within the community and by whites, and also this idea that environmentalism and a lot of the pollution and devastation that was going on around this time and had been going on historically was predominantly affecting Native women. Also, when we think about Native women's reproductive health, and we think about the adoption program and some of these other ones, a lot of the times Native motherhood and Native family structures are seen as bad, and that has enabled U.S. governmental agencies to take children away from Native mothers, which has also been disruptive and violent towards them, right? Again, restoration and security of treating rights. This is going to be a central issue for both organizations and has been a central concern of Native communities well over time. And then greater environmental and protections and rights, right? And then the ending of the Indian and Native culture commercialization and mascots. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in the next piece, but we've seen a lot of controversy around this with the Cleveland Indians, with the Washington, what was formerly the Washington Redskins, which is now the Washington football team, the Atlanta Braves, so on and so forth. And so this has been huge in terms of a large, persistent issue with these communities, but clearly across both of these, Native rights and the ability to practice their cultural lifeways is important and central, which has been something that has been under attack by U.S. governmental and military forces since the inception of the country, right? And so I'm going to close there, but again, we'll get into this a little bit deeper in the next lecture. But we've covered again the continued Indian problem, shifts in the Indian War from again this overt genocidal project to something that was much more indirect, stealing children away and separating those children from their culture, making Native culture unsustainable, right? Or making those children unable to continue it on, right? We saw examples of this boarding school, the Indian adoption program, how these BIA policies manifest as a form of cultural genocide, the convergence of white supremacy, the convergence of BIPOC issues and white supremacy, settler colonialism and the Indian problem, again, settler colonialism and white supremacy and how those things align. And then lastly, we kind of rounded off with key figures in the civil rights movement. So if you have any questions, as always, feel free to email me. Our key terms for today are deficit thinking, cultural genocide, and settler colonialism. Thank you again for tuning in and hope to see you soon.